All right. Hello and welcome to Rainforest Action Network's meeting on our 2025 Banking on Climate Chaos report. As we hear from our colleagues today, please feel free to put any questions you have in the Q&A feature or in the chat, and we'll address those once the presentation is complete. So in 2025, this year, we are celebrating RAND's 40th year of climate leadership. A couple of highlights are that this year we released a major report on a decade of successful forest campaigns in Indonesia, particularly Sumatra's Loser ecosystem, winning sweeping multilateral landscape protection programs, supporting partners to attain legal land rights, and attaining declining deforestation rates there. Also this year, our climate and energy team saw campaign wins as Chubb Insurance excluded multiple disastrous fossil fuel projects. And we launched our 16th annual Banking on Climate Chaos report that you'll hear more about today. Our Community Action Grants program dispersed 75 grants in 14 countries across 5 continents for a total of $825,000 supporting Indigenous and frontline community-led projects. We couldn't do this without our partners. We couldn't do it without you. So thank you so much for being here and for supporting RAN. And today, our focus is on the 2025 Banking on Climate Chaos report, where we'll be hearing from Diane Enriquez, our campaign director on the climate and energy team, to share about the team's focus. Caleb Schwartz, our research and policy analyst on our team, to give detail and insight about the report and the data. And Allison Fajans-Turner, senior finance campaigner, who will talk a bit about how we are utilizing the report this year. So I will pass it to you, Diane.
Thanks, Zan. And thank you everyone who's joining us. So our work is grounded in a simple but urgent goal: shifting private finance away from fossil fuels and toward a livable, just future. To do that, we focus on institutions that have the greatest leverage: banks and insurance companies. These sectors are still enabling the expansion of fossil fuels, especially LNG, or liquefied natural gas, which releases significant amounts of potent greenhouse gas, methane, into the atmosphere. We know that stopping expansion is essential to protecting our planet and our communities. But stopping harm isn't enough. We're also committed to enabling a just transition, one that supports workers, uplifts frontline communities, and ensures that the shift to clean energy is fair and equitable. That's why we're building and deepening long-term partnerships in the Gulf South and Southeast Asia, 2 regions on the front lines of both extraction, LNG export and import buildouts, and climate impacts. Our work is driven by 4 core strategies. We lead with rigorous research and data. We run inside-outside finance campaigns that pressure institutions from every angle. We stand in frontline partnership and solidarity, ensuring community leadership shapes every demand. And we invest in movement building, because shifting global finance requires all of us. Together, we're changing the flow of money and changing what's possible for our collective future. And this year marks the 16th edition of our report, produced in partnership with 7 organizations and backed by more than 480 endorsements from around the world. That level of support reflects the power and importance of the Banking on Climate Chaos report. For years, Rainforest Action Network has been an innovator in this space, and this report has become the gold standard for tracking fossil fuel financing. It's a critical tool for campaigners everywhere, used by hundreds of nonprofits to hold banks accountable by providing the hard receipts: exactly how much money they pour into the fossil fuel industry and where their policies continue to fall short. But it's not just campaigners who rely on this work. Policymakers, journalists, and shareholders use this report every year to understand the state of global financing and the risks it creates. It's cited by major media across the world. Most importantly, this report exposes the human impact behind the numbers, the frontline and indigenous communities who bear the worst effects of fossil fuel expansion and who have been leading the fight for climate justice for generations. One of the most powerful things about this report is that it's completely open source, which means partners, organizers, and movements around the world can use the data in real time to drive real change. And they use it every day. The report serves 5 core purposes. First, credibility. It gives campaign demands legitimacy by grounding them in rigorous, undeniable data. Second, it informs our demands, helping campaigners know exactly what to ask for and where the pressure needs to be applied. Third, it shapes our targeting strategy, showing which banks and which clients are driving the most harm, and helping connect frontline fights to the global power brokers behind them. Fourth, it opens doors for access and insight engagement. Banks are often more willing to sit down and discuss data and methodology, which creates an important opportunity to bring our broader demands and arguments directly into the room. And finally, the report is a major driver of media attention, helping shine a global spotlight on destructive fossil fuel finance and the institutions enabling it. This is more than a data set. It's a movement tool that shifts power, sharpens strategy, and fuels accountability. And I'm really excited for you to hear more from our speakers. So thank you for being a supporter of RAN and for joining us for their presentation. Caleb?
Thanks so much, Diane. Hi, everybody. My name is Caleb Schwartz. I am going to go over some of the main findings of the BOCC report that came out earlier this year. So next slide. The top line number is this. The world's 65 largest banks have financed $3.3 trillion to the fossil fuel industry just since 2021. Next slide. Of that 3.3 trillion, 1.6 trillion is going to the companies engaged in fossil fuel expansion, the companies that are doing the most to finance the companies that are expanding fossil fuels at a time when we can't afford that. Next slide. In 2024, these 65 banks, which are the biggest banks in the world, committed $869 billion to the industry. We saw this trend, and honestly, we're a bit surprised to see such a big uptick from 2023. This is an increase of over $162 billion compared to the year before. And of that $869 billion going to fossil fuel companies, $429 billion went to those companies doing the most to expand fossil fuels. So in a time when we should be seeing a downward trend of these figures, we're seeing an uptick. And indeed, this has been the case for the history of the report. So since 2016, when the year when the Paris Agreement went into effect, and the Paris Agreement, for those unfamiliar, an international treaty to limit global heating to well below 2 degrees Celsius, preferably 1.5 degrees Celsius. Banks continued to pour trillions into the fossil fuel industry, pouring $7.9 trillion cumulatively in financing commitments since that year. So next slide. So that's the big picture. And to dive a little bit deeper into some of these trends on the next slide, we can see the scope of this report. So when we're looking at these large banks, about half of the financing is coming from North America. The United States is a central focus of the report because it's providing about a third of the financing to fossil fuel companies in this report. Canada coming in with about 15% of the financing. Then Asia represents about a quarter of the financing, with China and Japan being the biggest countries contributing there. And then about another quarter, a little bit less than a quarter, is coming from European banks. This is a global problem. The financing from these wealthy banks is concentrated in a number of different countries, but the implications are global and they're financing companies all around the world. Next slide, please. So part of what the report does is it ranks banks. Here's the graphic for the Dirty Dozen banks. A lot of you on this call might be familiar with some of these names because these are the real climate villains of the story. JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citigroup take the top 3 spots, being 3 very large US banks. Mizuho Financial, Japanese bank, is number 4. Wells Fargo, MUFG, Barclays, Royal Bank of Canada, and so on. We're seeing a lot of US, Canadian, and Japanese banks really dominate the rankings, with Barclays thrown in there as a UK bank. And this is a problem. Some of these banks are really putting individually tens of billions of dollars into fossil fuels each year. But on the next slide, we can see that last year in 2024, 45 out of the 65 banks that we looked at actually increased their fossil finance. So it's not just concentrated in these big spenders, these big dirty banks. It's really across the board. Banks are ignoring the climate crisis. They're pouring money into these companies. And the report doesn't only analyze the numbers of and the dollar values of the financing. On the next slide, we have some examples of the policy context. So if you go to the website, you can see all of the numbers, all the receipts for what the banks are actually financing, and then there's a pretty detailed policy breakdown for each of the banks. And these numbers going up coincide with a really troubling trend, which is banks globally are backpedaling on their climate commitments and their fossil fuel restriction policies. Just two of the most egregious examples of this since the previous report. One is the collapse of the Net Zero Banking Alliance, the most ambitious international alliance of many banks to reduce their emissions, their financed emissions. We saw US banks walk away from that alliance, which led to Canadian banks and then Japanese banks also leaving the alliance. And the alliance, even though it had some initial problems and was flawed and not ambitious enough, it fell apart. We also see Wells Fargo, one of those massive US banks, reneging on both its 2050 long-term net zero targets and the 2030 near-term targets. Now, as of this date, other banks in the US have not done that same thing, totally dropping their targets. This was a very unique and troubling development for a bank to have a set of targets, which were already pretty weak and not ambitious enough, not fast enough, and just to drop them completely. So we're trying to stop this. So the movement is trying to hold these banks accountable. But I think this is really underscoring a lesson that we've been learning for the past decade and a half from this report, is that voluntary commitments, while they can indicate progress at certain banks making these voluntary policy commitments, there's a need for something more. There's a need for a movement to hold them accountable, and there's a need for regulators to step in, people to come to say, no, you have to stop financing. And there's we don't just believe in these voluntary commitments as being the source of all action. So next slide. Why is this all important? I keep bringing up this word expansion, and the Bank on Climate Chaos report tracks finance to these expansion companies. We keep a keen eye on a list of these companies that are doing the most to actually expand fossil fuel reserves. And this is because we know that fossil fuel expansion is totally incompatible with keeping in line with pathways to limit global temperature rise. I won't go into what all the lines on this chart means. You can check that out in the report, but essentially a number of major climate modelers out there based on the science and modeling have pretty resolutely declared that if we are to keep global heating to 1.5 degrees Celsius or less, to keep the climate to safe temperatures, there can be no new investment in oil, gas, coal production, no expansion. And that's not happening. That's very clearly not happening. And that was as of 2021. So we're behind. And to sort of drive this home further about policies and banks, we found that out of all of this financing to expansion companies, 70% of that financing came to these companies from banks that actually have an exclusion policy. So they have a policy on the books about climate, but it's too weak to actually stop that financing to these companies that are like the worst of the worst. So there's a problem. There's a big problem here. Our report has made this clear over the past decade and a half, but the problem is getting worse. Our report is not just about the numbers, though, and the problems. It's also about the impacts and the resistance and the solutions to it. So I'm actually going to pass it over to my colleague, Allison, to discuss some of that.
Thank you so much, Caleb. So as Caleb would just explain, the BOCC, it's a powerful tool for tracking the volume of money that is going to fossil fuels and expansion companies. But as my colleague Diane and as Caleb just reiterated, the BOCC also seeks to communicate the human impact of this financing. There are communities all around the globe coming into conflict with and actively resisting fossil fuel companies and the expansion projects these companies and their financial backers are driving. And the BOCC tries to elevate many of these fights. It does so in its From the Frontline section, which gives many of these fights boosted visibility. Each real-life example of struggle that is spotlighted in the BOCC is a fight where RAN and partners all over the world are working with affected communities on the ground in defense of their lives, their livelihoods, their human rights, and the climate. And so one of the main functions of the BOCC is to reinforce, to uplift, and inform these rights struggles. Let's go to the next slide. But how else is the BOCC being used, and how is it being used in different regions of the world? So in the US and Canada, RAN and various partners are using the BOCC data to strengthen ongoing campaigns on specific bank targets. Right now, there are active campaigns that are running on major banks like Citibank, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and the Royal Bank of Canada, and all of them are drawing on BOCC data. Interesting note about Royal Bank of Canada, when BOCC's data showed that RBC was actually the largest annual financer of fossil fuels in 2022, so a few years ago, the amount of scrutiny and campaigning pressure that RBC felt in the wake of that report actually resulted in RBC making some internal staffing and policy changes and slowing its rate of fossil fuel financing. It has much further to go. As you saw from Caleb's slides earlier, it's still one of the top 12 dirty dozen banks in the world. But it is also a clear demonstration of how the BOCC can and has shifted bank behavior. So the BOCC data, it's also been used to equip groups of investors and investor networks in major Wall Street banks to inform their engagement with those banks. And something that Diane mentioned earlier is that the BOCC remains one of the best access points that RAN and NGO partners kind of across the movement have to major banks, especially major North American banks, who care enough about the data and how they rank compared to their peers that they will meet and engage with us. And that gives us the opportunity for us to bring other campaign demands to their attention. Next slide, please. So in Japan, our US-based team has worked really closely with our Japanese-based team and other partners in Japan to call out the fast increasing levels of financing from the 3 Japanese megabanks to fossil fuels and fossil fuel expansion. This past spring, so for the 2025 BOCC report, RAN also produced a special analysis that expanded on BOCC data, but focused specifically on the 3 mega Japanese banks. That report was used to strengthen campaigns, pushing for reforms at the annual general meetings of Japanese megabanks, especially a campaign being run around MUFG. The BOCC report data has also been used to equip delegations of Gulf South leaders from the US that RAN has helped organize and resource. And these delegations have actually traveled to Japan to meet face-to-face with Japanese banks and insurance teams and alert those teams to the harm that the companies and projects that these Japanese financial institutions are financing are causing in their communities. And then another thing to note about our work in Japan is that RAN has achieved strong penetration of the report with Japanese media. We've done this by holding successful Japanese translated media briefings and landing prominent stories in major Japanese financial outlets. And that has even inspired reporters from one of Japan's major media outlets to conduct a reporting field trip to the LNG front lines in the US, coming to Texas and Louisiana. And RAN worked with that reporter, helped kind of coordinate some of their travel, and helped line up interviews with affected community members for that trip. Let's go to the next slide. In Europe, the BOCC data is again being used to reinforce specific campaigns on UK and EU bank targets. It is being used by several of the core authoring BOCC partners to inform additional and deeper analysis that these organizations are doing on specific fossil fuel sectors This includes our partner Ergowald's Still Banking on Coal report, as well as Reclaim Finance's LNG analysis and a website that they are going to be launching shortly, as well as a recent first of its kind report on the amount of bank financing actually going to the sustainable power supply sector. And RAN has had a role in consulting and advising and helping on all of these reports. And then the BOCC has been cited in reports and papers produced by third parties that have focused on EU banking regulation, on tax justice, and to inform legal arguments in cases that have been brought in the UK and EU. Next slide, please. And I believe this is our last slide too. But in China, where it is very hard to engage banks directly, RAN is working with partners to use BOCC data to engage Chinese government financial regulators and groups of investors. These are investors that are both Chinese and non-Chinese, but that have financial stakes in the 14 Chinese banks that are profiled in the BOCC report. The BOCC data is central to a range of tactics we are using to engage these audiences. As mentioned on the previous slide, our partner Ergowald has used BOCC plus data to inform its annual update on the Still Banking on Coal report. That report continues to underscore China's role as the world's top coal financier. We've then consolidated the top findings on Chinese banks from the Still Banking on Coal and the BOCC reports into a letter that is actually being delivered this week at COP30 to officials of China's National Financial Regulatory Administration. Officials from the NFRA are participating in the UN climate talks down in Belém. And we're doing a hand delivery of that letter. The letter highlights levels and trends of Chinese bank fossil fuel financing, how Chinese banks compare importantly to each other and relative to other regions. And it contains recommendations for how to lower climate-related financial risk of Chinese banks and accelerate their rates, their shift from fossil fuel to greater sustainable financing as well. And then we are working with partners to organize webinars for the Chinese and non-Chinese investor audiences. Those webinars have guidance on questions and pressure points to engage Chinese banks. And while direct engagement with Chinese banks does not tend to elicit a strong response from those banks, we have also worked with partners in China to hand deliver copies of the BOCC report directly to the management teams at Chinese banks, which makes it harder for them to ignore. And as I said before, I believe this is our last slide, brings us to the end of our presentation. So I'll pass it back to my colleague, Zan.
Thanks so much, Diane, Caleb, and Allison. And we only have about 6 minutes to answer a lot of great questions. So I'm going to introduce my colleague, Emily, in our development team, who will ask the first question. And if we don't get to them all, we will reach out to you. But also, Jennifer, if you can put a couple of our email addresses in the chat, please reach out to us, and we'd love to further engage and make sure we can answer your questions. Over to you, Emily.
Yeah, I'm going to ask one of the first questions that came in that I think is on a lot of people's minds right now. How does the current political context in the US affect banks' willingness to adopt climate-friendly policies? Diane, do you want to take this one to start?
Yeah, so obviously the political context affects everything from the interest to like both for US banks in particular to like publicly sign on to any kind of progressive or climate specific policy. However, the importance of the work that we are building and that we do is that we don't just focus on national US context. We also work with banks across the globe, particularly. We've had a lot of success with engagement around Japanese banks and Japanese insurance companies, European banks and insurance companies, and also our growing body of work in Southeast Asia. And so I think that despite the political context in the US, there's still a lot of progress to be made. And it's also just important for us to keep accountability and keep pressure on US banks in particular, given the current context.
Thanks so much, Diane. And there's a question also about why there's an uptick in financing for fossil fuels and whether AI is part of driving that uptick. Caleb, do you have any sense of, why the investment's increasing and if AI has anything to do with that?
Yeah, thanks for this question. So AI is certainly a reason that fossil fuel companies are justifying their expansion. We've seen in the case of liquefied natural gas, methane gas exports in the US, a thing that we've studied very closely. We have definitely seen this used a lot by the companies to justify building these massive expansion terminals to basically take gas and ship it around the world. And right now in the US, about 40% of the power demand for or the power generation for AI and data centers is coming from methane gas, so-called natural gas. So it's definitely a reason that these expansion projects are justified. It's not the only reason. I think there's a lot of false narratives about there, such as methane gas is a bridge fuel to a cleaner future. That's one that we've been fighting for a while because it's not a cleaner fuel than what's out there. So yeah, there's a lot of different factors. But I think at the end of the day, what's most important about this is that the growth of fossil fuel demand is not inevitable. But these companies want us to think it is. They want governments to plan as if we're going to need to double, triple, quadruple the energy generation from for these new data centers, and as if we're going to need to, build these new natural gas terminals that we're getting locked into for a couple decades. And I think there's a lot of really strong resistance that are pushing back on that inevitability narrative. And we need to keep going. There's a lot of resistance to new data centers that's popping up, and people are getting organized, and we need to keep pushing on that.
Thanks, Caleb. I can jump in because there's a couple good questions in here about renewables. Allison, maybe you can take this on. Do any of these dirty banks invest in solar, wind, or green energy? How do we know? And is there a way to tell how much is being invested in renewables versus the investment in fossil fuels?
Thank you, Emily, for that question, and everyone that has this on their mind. Yes, and I would actually point to a report that I mentioned in my remarks that Reclaimed Finance has recently published, which looks at bank financing to the sustainable power supply sector. And they are also very concerned in that report about defining credible sources of sustainable power. We often have a problem with how sustainable power actually gets defined, with banks using very greenwashy language around what they're considering sustainable. That report also takes the BOCC fossil fuel data, and it actually comes up with a ratio. So it looks at how much banks are putting into sustainable power versus the amount that those same banks are putting into fossil fuels. So that's actually a really interesting index and good guide for us to kind of judge from. I will say that most big banks do have money that they're putting into sustainable power. We've got to see that get much more. We have to reach at least a ratio of 4-to-1, or you could even say 6-to-1 on the kind of truly ambitious, truly Paris-aligned side of the spectrum. And most banks are nowhere near that. The bank that is closest, that's a large bank, one of the top 65 in the world, is BNP Paribas Bank in France. La Banque Postale, I think. It's a French bank. It is not a US bank. US banks are bad at this. They're the most lagging. If you're looking for a good bank, European banks are further along in their alignment with a 1.5-degree trajectory and the Paris Agreement. But even large European banks are not there yet. We've got to keep pushing on all banks It is really important to look at mid-sized banks and to look at local banks, to look at climate fintech banks that have much lower exposures to fossil fuels. Often they don't have very strong climate commitments, although there are some that do. But if you can, shift some of your money into smaller banking, mid-sized banks, that's a great way to go. Understanding that that there are some difficulties there. I will also flag that it's not just about moving banking services, it's moving other kinds of financial services. And that includes where you have credit cards. And there's actually some interesting research that's going to be coming out shortly that looks at the exposure of major credit cards to fossil fuels and finds that there are actually some really big credit card companies out there that have much lower rates of exposure. They're not run by the big banks, but something like American Express and Synchrony has like a much lower exposure rate to a Chase credit card, something like that. So
awesome. Thank you so much, Allison. You answered that last question that we always get is what are the good banks? And the big picture answer is that, none of them are doing the right thing right now at the highest levels, those dirty dozen. So we need to keep putting pressure on them within the movement to have them change their behavior. And we are over time. Sorry, we're a couple minutes over, but thank you all so much for being here and learning about our fossil fuel investment report that comes out every year. We will follow up with a recording of this and look forward to staying engaged with this audience. Thanks for being here.